Okay, so welcome to the Superna Eyeglass webinar focusing on all things DR and failover with Isilon. If you have any questions at any point during the webinar, feel free to use the chat function. I'll keep an eye on it as best I can. If not, I'll get to it at some point nearer to the end. We'll have an open Q&A session as well at the end, so if you have any questions at that point, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. So the agenda that I've set for this webinar is as follows. So we'll talk first about the problems addressed by Eyeglass DR. How does Eyeglass automate failover? Which steps are automated? We'll look at the UI, so the Eyeglass DR UI, and then a Q&A, like I said, towards the end. So which problems are addressed by Eyeglass DR? Well, Isilon manual failover process is long and complicated, so I don't know if anybody has tried a manual failover of the Isilon in the past, but there's a lot of steps. Environments change very often, so you have to keep updating your runbook plan. DR runbooks are complicated and always out of date for those same reasons. Maintaining failover scripts is time-consuming, not practical. Completing a failover requires admin access to make DNS and Active Directory changes. You don't get any RPO reporting or RPO alerting for your DR readiness, so natively available on the Isilon. Configuration replication, so managing the replication of your SMB shares and NFS exports, NFS aliases is all manual, so without Eyeglass in that case. And then you don't really have any, mostly you have a data, obviously, migration tool, but you don't have a configuration migration tool between clusters as well. So when this is when you want to move your configuration maybe from one access zone into another on the same cluster, on a different cluster, and so on. So Eyeglass DR is a small virtual appliance. It requires the ability to communicate with all Isilon clusters in your environment over port 8080 and for the REST API, and port 22 for some small amount of SSH that we need as well. So in this diagram, we try to represent each of these little blue bubbles as a manual step that needs to be run or validated during the execution of the failover itself. With Eyeglass, all of these steps become automated. I would say with the exception of number 1 and number 2, there's still some manual effort here required. So you need, first of all, to decide which failover method is best or well suited to your organization, because we have a few different ones that I'll cover in a couple slides here. So choosing and configuring the best failover method for you could be a combination of them, could be, just one, whatever is easiest. And then the second one is actually pushing the button to execute the failover. So while we automate all of the steps of the actual failover itself, it still requires a human to decide we need to failover, and we're going to push the button to say, I want to failover. And specifically, you can decide, I want to failover just this SyncIQ policy or just this access zone or just this pool, stuff like that. And so talking about some, which steps are automated by Eyeglass, I like to break this up into different phases. But Eyeglass, like I said, will run all the steps required in the correct sequence to complete the failover. And the amount of steps vary depending on the amount of SyncIQ policies and failover types, but they can be broken up into 4 main phases. Phase number one, final data sync. So Eyeglass will remove SyncIQ policy schedules and run each policy once to ensure the latest data is synced to the target cluster. Phase number 2 is client redirection. These steps vary depending on the failover type, but this would generally include the failover of like a Smart Connect zone name from one cluster to the other, updating SPNs in Active Directory, or renaming shares if you're using DFS-based failover. Phase number 3, make target writable. So that will just make the target cluster writable along each SyncIQ policy path. At this point, after phase 3, I like to say failover is complete. Everything that happens after this point is going to be phase 4, which is preparation for failback, includes creating the SyncIQ policies to do the reverse replication, setting the schedules on them, running those policies, making sure they're in a good state, and otherwise updating everything that Eyeglass sees in its inventory to ensure that you are ready for a failback as soon as the entire process is done, if you needed to, of course. So what are the different failover types or methods that we have available? There's 4 different failover methods that you can configure. Each of them offers a different level of automation and granularity. So the first, there's SyncIQ policy-based. This is the most granular option with the least amount of automation. It requires that you would manually redirect your clients with a DNS or Smart Connect remount. Although this works well if you're just trying to do something very quick and granular where you just want to make one SyncIQ policy path writable at the DR side, and then you'll worry about directing your client over to that side, which you could do by either making like a DNS change, or if you're planning on moving the Smart Connect manually, something of that sort. But anyways, a granular failover method with SyncIQ policy based. Microsoft DFS obviously applies. It's a fully automated and granular failover method. It works seamlessly for clients that access data via a DFS namespace, of course. So not so much very appropriate for clients who access with over the NFS protocol, because they're likely not using DFS. But a very granular failover, fully automated option. And like I said, seamless for clients. In most cases, they wouldn't even notice that they've been redirected to the other cluster. Number 3, I'd say, is probably the most common one that I see deployed. It allows you for the ability to failover, so access zone failover allows you the ability to failover an access zone and all of the Smart Connect zone names within that access zone. Within all of the IP pools that are associated to that access zone. So of course, on the Isilon, when you create a new IP pool, you define it to an access zone. Let's say you have like a data access zone, you decide to fail it over and it has 4 IP pools. All of the 4 Smart Connect zone names can be failed over as part of initiating that action. Or you can decide if you want to go somewhere more granular, you can do number 4, IP pool based or Smart Connect. So essentially it's a more granular version of access zone failover. You can failover just a single Smart Connect from one IP pool if you'd like. So even if it's within the same access zone as other IP pools on the cluster. So at this point, I'm going to move to doing a quick DR overview just of the UI. And you'll see a few different icons on the desktop once I open up here, but I'm a firm believer in that if you understand 3 of the icons very well, then you're already on your way to being an expert in DR, at least with Isilon and Superna Eyeglass. So the first of which is jobs. So let's say that's the first icon that you need to understand. DR dashboard is the second, and then DR assistant is the third. So I'll start in the sequence. So we'll go with the jobs one first. Jobs that are created automatically here by Superna Eyeglass when it does an inventory of the Isilon. It does an inventory of the Isilon every 5 minutes by default. And the things that it looks for are things like configuration changes, like if you created a new IP pool, or if you've created a new share or a new NFS export, a new SyncIQ policy, anything, it'll detect that it's been created. But when it detects new SyncIQ policies, it will create these jobs automatically. And you can tell by the section, the title of the section, what each of these will do. But let me just collapse all of these. We'll go through some of the important ones. The first of which is configuration, replication, share, export, alias. So why jobs is important? If you're going to think of even failing over to the DR cluster, you need to make sure that your configuration is synced. So primarily, this is your SMB shares, your NFS exports, your NFS aliases. And so because these jobs are automatically created based on the SyncIQ policies that exist on the cluster, all you would need to do is come in here, enable the one that you want to replicate the configuration for, and then run it, or just allow it to run on its regular schedule, which, like I said, for this would be every 5 minutes. So as soon as you do this, you enable this job, it will automatically start creating the shares or exports on the target cluster. And likewise, if you in future now made any changes to the share itself on the source cluster, it will automatically get replicated by this process on its regular schedule. So you have this ongoing tool that will just keep making sure that the configuration, so the metadata, is in sync between both clusters. And likewise, you have the option to say, well, I don't want to replicate the shares that exist under that path. You could do skip the share replication. Then there's a one for snapshot schedules. So if you want to be able to replicate your snapshot IQ schedules from one cluster to the other, you can enable a job to do so. Then there's the smart quotas. So you can move the smart quotas as well. General best practice from Dell EMC side is not to pre-stage these smart quotas. So the way we treat these is we keep them only on the source cluster. If you were to execute a failover, then we will create them on the target cluster. So that's why it has its own section here. And that's pretty well it. There's a few other ones here, probably not worth going into too much detail about. We could do like access zone replication as well. But primarily, if your readiness for failover is going to be making sure that your metadata, all the shares and their permissions, all the NFS exports and the client lists are synced over to the DR site. And so that's just used by the job here in this first section. So when I say, 3 pieces or 3 icons you need to understand in Eyeglass, if you know what your way around the jobs window, you can see, details about the policy name and all that stuff in here. You can see running job information in here. If you know your way around that interface and you know how to find if there's any errors in replication, things like that, then I think that's already a very good start. Now, the first thing to check, if you're planning to failover for whatever reason, you come in here and you see that the jobs are in a good state. So they have a recent run date. So for me, they just ran 5 minutes ago. And checking, of course, that the state is good. Then let's move on to the second thing to check. So that's DR dashboard. So now on the left side here, you see the different failover types. So there's access zone failover, IP pool based failover, DFS, and SyncIQ policy based. And so here's where you would choose, which failover method you have configured and which one you want to actually test with. And then what this part of the product does is essentially just validate your readiness for failover. It does this every 15 minutes by default. It will go out to the Isilon, retrieve inventory information. It will look to see if you've made any changes. Like if you added an additional IP pool to that access zone, then it needs to know if you're going to plan to fail it over or not, and so on. And then within here, it validates the readiness. So you'll see there's a lot of things that we look for, and they range from being able to create and delete an SPN in Active Directory to making sure that the SyncIQ policy is in a good state. So I'll show some of those right there, but SyncIQ policy status is good. The policy is enabled. There's no duplicate local targets on the target cluster. There's no corrupt failover snapshots. There's a lot of things here that we validate. So configuration, replication, making sure that the shares and exports are synced over correctly. SPNs are ready. And there's a warning for DNS dual delegation validation here. I likely already have this configured, but I won't spend too much time looking at the reasons for that for now. So yes, a lot of things we validate for. So this obviously is with this automation means these are things that you no longer need to check prior to executing your failover. This process runs every 15 minutes. It will update what it sees in DR dashboard. If the status ever changes from okay or info to warning or to error, then you will get an alert to your email if you've configured the email notifications that tells you, hey, this zone is not configured or ready for failover just yet. And then you would have to go in, resolve it, and move on from there. And yes, so like I said, there's other failover types in here. So moving on, so jobs, again, just a quick refresher, used for configuration sync, so configuration replication from one cluster to the other. DR dashboard is used for failover readiness, so to validate that you are ready for failover. If you're not ready for failover, it will give you some more information as to what needs to be fixed or what you need to address. And then the third one is the simpler one, is to execute the failover itself. So to execute the failover, essentially you just need to pick the failover type again up here. Then you pick your source cluster. We'll pick this one as an example. And then you pick the different options you want it to run as part of the failover. So if you want it to run a final data sync, then you leave that item selected. There's an option here, SMB data integrity failover, that allows you to put a deny permission on all the shares that are being failed over. So it's a way to prevent users from being able to access whatever you're failing over in that moment, essentially trimming down the risk of data loss, right? Because if you deny the access to the share and then we run the data sync, then there's going to be no data loss in theory. And then SyncIQ resync prep, that's going to be preparation for failback and so on. So you pick the different options. We'll go with that for now, just to go through this UI very briefly. And then you pick the access zone that you wish to fail over. You have some acknowledgement state right here. And then run failover. So easy enough. So when I said in the beginning, the steps that are automated, well, from now on, everything will be automated, that it's going to go through the whole failover process, including all of those phases that I mentioned. So right now it's doing phase 1, which is starting the SyncIQ job. So it's just creating or running the SyncIQ to get the latest data on the other cluster. Now it's doing the client redirect. So this was phase 2, where it's moving the Smart Connect zone name, updating the SPNs in Active Directory. And then once this part is done, it's going to move to phase 3. Phase 3 is going to be executing the allow write step. And then phase 4 will be resync prep. I'll leave this open to the side here. And then some other things you can look at here, you can look at failover history. So the amount of times you've executed failover in the past, as well as any previous logs that you might see. So I do have a process here that runs every night to execute the failover, and it does have the failover logs stored in here, so I can review them and see if there's any issue. Looks like I have a minor SPN issue, but no consequence for today anyway. So that's the quick overview on this on the UI here. Really, like I said, those 3 things, if you focus on understanding what the purpose of the jobs window is, what the purpose of the DR dashboard is, and then purpose of DR assistant, then you're well on your way to becoming an expert in Cipher and Eyeglass DR. Okay, so I'm going to cover these other features fairly quickly, give you guys some time for the Q&A here at the end. So we have a failover tool that's called Eyeglass Runbook Robot. The purpose of this tool is it will automatically test failover for you on a daily basis. You configure this to use whichever failover method is your preferred type. Once you have it configured, it will automatically fail over on a daily basis. So tonight it would fail over, tomorrow it would fail back, and it just keeps going back and forth like that. Of course, you would configure this on an environment that doesn't have, or a directory that doesn't have production data. This is simply just a test, a failover test. You would want to configure this within its own access zone. At very minimum, give it its own SyncIQ policy path that doesn't overlap with any of your production data. So of course, this is a good way to test that failover is working without actually executing a production failover. Then we have this other feature that's essentially allows you to make the target copy of the data, or the DR copy of the data, writable. At that point, you can go and redirect your clients, get them to connect to that directory and start writing whatever they need to do as part of this DR test. As soon as they're completed, then we basically run the SyncIQ policy to erase the changes that were made on the target cluster. So it's a good, obviously a DR validation, DR data integrity exercise, but there is a way obviously to be able to just manipulate that copy of the data. Then there's another option where you could create a clone copy of the data. So if you don't want to manipulate the DR copy itself, you can use this method. So it's called LiveOps DR testing. With this method, we can create a clone copy within the DR cluster, and then we can choose to test with that one. So the benefits of this solution over the DR rehearsal is that we don't have to stop the replication from production to DR. And we're also not manipulating the DR copy because we're creating a clone of the DR copy. And that's it. So all I had planned to cover for now, and to give you guys some time for Q&A here. There are some free labs you can schedule on our website. So supernayeglass.com/booking. Within there, you'll find labs for all of the different failover types that I covered today. And as well, if you want to have more information, including anything about doing a demo or booking any sort of labs, or to get information on quoting, pricing, and so on, you can just email sales@superna.net. And with that, if anybody has any questions, I'll take them now. If you want, you can also type them in the chat. Feel free.
Can you hear what I say?
Yep, I can hear you. Hey, John.
Okay. Hi. I have a question, and that's related to the DFS failover, which we was planning to do, and is actually still having it set up. But it is with certain challenge, because in order to have this work, we need to have 2 entries per DFS entry, one for one side and one for the other side. And the issue is that when doing a failover, we need to disable the inactive part of it, because the default SMB seems to be hanging a lot of time at the one that isn't active. Issue here is there's no way to actually scripting from Superna Eyeglass and into the DFS part of it, because obviously we cannot use any Windows-based scripting from Superna Eyeglass appliance box itself. So my question is, would there be any kind of solution from Superna's side that fix this issue? I mean, you can manipulate against the AD itself. So my assumption is it would be possible to also create a solutions that manipulate the DFS.
That's a good question. I can't say for sure whether or not there's something that's going to be planned. In terms of what our preference is always to just be able to have to only communicate with the Isilon. So obviously we don't want to have to add another layer where we have to go direct to DFS or Active Directory or anything like that. But have you tried the? I know there's a Microsoft knowledge base article covering this, where you just need to apply some patch to fix it. In any case, I can email that to you over afterwards if you'd like. We can even schedule a separate call to review.
Yes, thank you, because I haven't heard about that, and the things that we have tried have been a dead end. So we are actually stuck on this, and we have a manual script we need to run each time. But as you know, with automation, if you have to kind of do manual things afterwards, that's the one we always forget, and that's maybe giving a lot of issues. We have in our cluster 35,000 users, and that means in a failover situation, we will deal with about 17,000 users that we need to go and enable entries on. That is a tough job to do that.
Okay, no problem.
We have to do that manually.
We can talk about that after. Thanks.
That's good.
Anybody else have any questions?
Yes, I would have a question. My question is, we have a lot of access zones, like 70, and we are trying to consolidate. Nowadays, we are doing SyncIQ replication on the top level of the access zone. After consolidation, we are thinking about replicating subdirectories. Would it be supported, like one level under the top level of access zone? Is it supported with Superna?
Yeah, so let's say, for example, your access zone base path is at IFS/data. Are you thinking to create a SyncIQ policy at IFS/data/share1, for example?
Yes, share 1, share 2, share 3, share 4, and so on, like a
no
70
problem.
of them.
Yeah, no problem. That works.
And the question is, do you support smart lock policies?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we just as part of executing a failover or doing a configuration sync, we're not able to sync the smart lock settings, so those need to be synced manually. So while we do technically support smart lock. It doesn't cause us any issue. You do need to replicate or create those settings manually on the target cluster.
Okay. And if we do, because for us, each share would have its own, like SyncIQ policy would have its own access zone, no access zones, smart connect zone, alias. And the question is, would it be able to failover within like a smart connect failover within this zone, like with many SyncIQ policies? So per SyncIQ policy failover, smart connect zone
Yep.
failover.
Yeah. So if you execute a failover of an access zone, it will detect all of the SyncIQ policies that exist beneath that access zone base path. So if you have 70 policies, then it will likely execute all 70 policy failovers. And likewise, if you have Smart Connect zone aliases within that IP pool, it's going to fail over the Smart Connect zone name and the Smart Connect zone aliases that exist on that pool.
Okay, but if we want to fail over only one smart connect policy, alias, yeah, would it work also? So we are thinking about running like an active situation with one access zone. Would it work on both sides?
I think with that method, you may look to do something like IP pool based failover configuration. How that works is you see all of your list of IP pools, and then you can decide to just say, okay, well, this IP pool has these SyncIQ policies. So you can basically drag and drop in a UI that says these policies belong to this pool. And then when you execute a failover of that pool, in the Smart Connect in that pool, then it's going to only take actions on the policies that you've mapped to the pool. In terms of like your first question, we can't do granular just like one alias, Smart Connect zone alias failover just yet, but it is planned for a future release that we should have that ability to just say, okay, we have a pool that has, a Smart Connect zone name and 10 Smart Connect zone aliases. We want to fail over just one alias. Something that's planned for a future release. I can't say when exactly, but
But right now, the solution would be to do IP pool failover, right?
I think so. Yeah, I can send you an email after, and we can talk about it if you'd like.
Yes, I would like to, because we have also DFS shares over there. So the question is, would it also allow us to do like a DFS failover on the Smart Connect zone, Smart Connect level, Smart Connect alias level. So this kind. So likely we have a department that is using its own, let's say, virtual filer with the Smart Connect zone name, and then we would like only to fail over this SyncIQ policy with this Smart Connect zone name.
Okay, I'll contact you. We can discuss it afterwards.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else while we're on? I know we've gone over the time a little bit, so if you do need to drop, feel free. But if anybody else has any questions.
Yes, I had a question about the two last things you showed, the DR rehearsal and the DR testing. Are those included as part of the Eyeglass DR license or such?
Yeah, that's right. So they're not. It's not a separate license. It's included in Eyeglass DR.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I have a question in the chat from Paul. Does Superna back up all the SyncIQ policy parameters from the source system? The answer to that is yes. So we take a cluster configuration report from the cluster on a daily basis. We also run like RPO reports, and you can set those to be whatever frequency they are. But that shows SyncIQ policy information and the like. So cluster configuration report will actually show all of the configuration on the Isilon in an HTML format. Second question, can you use Superna to help you fail over anything else apart from Isilon? No, not currently. So really we're just dedicated mostly to the Isilon nowadays.
I would have another question. you showed us a smart configuration replication job. What does it really does? Because if we use DFS failover and access zone failover, which type of jobs we have to enable? What does it really do? This configuration replication. We have already like the first job, right, that you showed us.
Yeah, so you know how SyncIQ is used for replicating data, right? So you configure SyncIQ on the Isilon, you point it to a path, and it replicates all the data from one cluster to the other along whichever paths you defined. Now, the configuration replication job in Superna will replicate configuration. So things like, let's say you create under that SyncIQ policy path, you have like 10 SMB shares with permissions and everything, and 10 NFS exports, for example. Then when you enable the configuration replication job, it will replicate those shares, create those shares on the target cluster. SyncIQ will always be used for data. Eyeglass doesn't do anything with that. The only thing it looks at is which shares exports exist beneath that SyncIQ policy path, and it will create them or sync them on the target. So even if you make a change to the share in the future, you'll make sure that the share is already synced over to the target cluster. The purpose, of course, is if you were to execute a DR, you want to make sure that your shares are there. And it's something that SyncIQ doesn't do natively. So
Yes.
syncing of the SMB shares.
That's what I understand. This is the first job that you showed us on the top level. Can you show the GUI right now? Again,
Yeah, sure.
Under
Yeah.
jobs.
Right here. So
this is configuration replication. And we have also we have configuration replication DFS mode that renames the shares. And then you have at the bottom, if you scroll down,
Yep.
if you scroll down to the end of this, you have configuration replication access zone replication. What does this one? I don't get what is it for?
Replicates access zone configuration. So if you create a new access zone on the source cluster, it can create that same access zone on the target cluster if you just enable this job.
Okay. So it makes sure that we have access zone configured on the other side.
Right. That's right.
But we have to have it because we have SyncIQ already in place.
Yeah.
So I don't get.
Naturally, the path will already be there. By creating the act of creating a SyncIQ policy, all it does was going to sync the data. It doesn't care if you have the access zone created. It doesn't care if you have the shares or the exports or anything like that. So we're an add-on to SyncIQ in that we will also sync the configuration that exists beneath those paths to the target cluster. We can talk about this after if you'd like. I'll send you an email. I have a couple of questions I want to get through. So do you have any suggestions on failing over the entire cluster? Sure, for the most part, it depends on the requirements. There's, of course, the different failover types to go through. Primarily the one that I see that's more appropriate for failing over the entire cluster. And it depends on whether or not Smart Connect failover is required. Then you would go with something like access zone. Generally, that's the simplest one to configure, and they'll mostly will catch everything in one go. So you fail over the access zone. If you have multiple pools, then all of those pools will get failed over. Second one, can we move an access zone from system to another on the same cluster via Eyeglass DR? The answer is yes. There's this tool here that we created for that purpose. So it's just called data config migration, but you would choose the source path in here. You pick your source cluster, you pick the access zone. And so here you have the option to say, I want to do it within the same cluster. So you could say, I want to go to data. And this would create a SyncIQ policy as well as a configuration replication job that will sync data and configuration from the system access zone into the data access zone. If the paths are the same, so if the paths are going the same, but you basically just want to create the configuration on the data access zone within that same cluster, you can choose to do migrate only configuration. And this will not sync the data because we can assume that the data is already there. And there, you obviously have the option to choose a different cluster as well. So you can say, I want to go to that zone and so on. So there's this tool that we created for that purpose. Okay, one more question. If you have both NFS and DFS in the same access zone, what would be the best failover method? It depends on how much automation you want. If you want, full automation, then I would say a Smart Connect failover would be best. You could, execute a Smart Connect failover and it will remount your DFS clients should be remounted. It requires some extra DNS configuration and some Active Directory configuration as well because you're moving SPNs at that point. But with NFS, like let's say you could execute like a DFS failover if you wanted to. There's NFS clients would have to remount manually, let's say to like a new name. So again, that's why I mean like it depends on the amount of automation that you wanted. If you want full automation, then you would go with something like Smart Connect based failover. So either access zone or Smart Connect IP pool failover. If you want to have full automation for DFS and you're okay with remounting NFS clients to use a new name once the failover is completed, then you could do DFS based failover. That should work fine because it's all path based. Will it automatically do DFS failovers when you have both NFS and DFS? Not necessarily. It depends on which failover method you configure. I think the way that you've probably configured is that you do have some jobs already in DFS mode, but I can decide to do like an access zone failover that has jobs in DFS mode. And let's say you have an access zone that has two IP pools. You can define one of them that's accessible for clients that use DFS. So you have a Smart Connect zone name in there that's configured for let's say access for DFS clients. So through the DFS namespace points to that Smart Connect zone name. And then you have another IP pool within that same access zone that's dedicated for NFS clients. You can choose to execute an access zone failover that will move only the Smart Connect for the NFS, and it will leave the one for the DFS because you need it to stay as part of like the way that, DFS failover method works. Can you run the failover in an audit mode to see what will happen with a given failover method? Not really. I think the best way to do this is to test with the Eyeglass runbook robot. So to use and to configure, so that was this failover testing tool that I mentioned just briefly here. But this one, you can set it up to failover between a pair of clusters in whichever failover method you want. So let's say your production, you're configuring for access zone failover based. You can configure this Eyeglass runbook robot tool within its own access zone, give it its own shares, its own sync IQ policy, an IP pool, and everything. Create it and configure it the same way as you would production, and then execute the failover and failback. I'd say this is probably the closest we have to some sort of audit. And then there's obviously the other features, rehearsal and live ops, that do a bit more of like DR testing where they make the target writable, but they don't, for example, rehearsal, it keeps the production online. And it just makes the target side writable just so you can make whatever changes to satisfy a DR test. So the audit, I'd say the best way to test that would be obviously to, not use production data. So something like the Eyeglass runbook robot. I think alternatively, of course, there's the DR dashboard that shows you if you are ready for failover or not. So yes, I mean, so Slavomir, it does failover both. That's what I mean. So if you did access zone failover, you can, let's say you have two IP pools, you can define what you want Eyeglass to do with each IP pool. With DFS, if you're doing DFS-based failover, you don't want the Smart Connect to failover because you have two folder targets in DFS. So you place an ignore on that pool to say, I don't want this pool to failover. And then the NFS one, you could say, I do want this pool to failover. And when you execute the failover, you'll see something like this. So I'll show you just as an example here. You'll have like a pool here that says this one's ignored, so it's not included as part of the failover. This would be your DFS pool. And then you have one that says that it is mapped. So you would see both of them in this UI, right? But for the sake of just showing this right now, we see just this one is mapped and the other one is not mapped. So there's a way to say, I want to failover this smart connect zone name in this IP pool, but I don't want to failover this other one because it's for DFS. So there is a way to accomplish, failover of NFS and DFS clients together in one failover. You could do access zone based for that. Okay. Yeah, it's good for now. If you guys have any further questions, just send an email to sales@superna.net. I mean, some of you probably already have my contact information as well, so feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. Otherwise, I think I'll stop it here. Thanks for joining today, everyone. I appreciated all your questions. A lot of good ones.